the Center for Bee Ecology, Evolution and Conservation at York University is really excited to present this conversation. And as we gather today and open this event, I want to take a moment to pause and reflect on our relationship with the history of the land upon which York University is built. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tuggeranto has been caretaken by the Nishnawbik Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As we are coming together from different areas across Ontario and beyond, please also consider the unique history of the land upon which you are joining us from today. Today marks the first of 3 interdisciplinary discussions that the Center for Bee Ecology, Evolution and Conservation is hosting over the course of this summer. And today's talk is titled Bees, Land and Food Justice. And joining us today is Dr. Adrianne Xavier, and she is the Acting Director of the Indigenous Studies Program at McMaster University. She is an Onondaga, and I hope I said that correctly, and Mohawk woman from 6 nations of the Grand River, whose work and research is focused on Indigenous food sovereignty and building food systems. Welcome, Adrianne. We also have Dr. Sarah Rotz, an assistant professor at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University, and she investigates themes of environmental justice with a focus on land and food systems in her research. And we also have Dr. Sheila Colla. She is York University's Research Chair in Interdisciplinary Conservation Science and Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. She researches the factors affecting native bee decline, improves conservation efforts, and examines the human dimension of pollinator conservation, including stakeholder perspectives, citizen science, and incorporating biocultural knowledge systems. Welcome to the 3 of you. I'm going to take this moment to turn off my mic and my video so that the 3 of you are center stage.
Awesome, thank you. And this is, I think, a pretty casual, I'm going to turn on my light here. I just realized how dark it got with the clouds coming in. Yeah, so I think this is kind of like more of a casual discussion. So Sarah and Adrianne, to start, should we each kind of just talk about what we do? Yeah, so Adrianne, do you want to start?
Sure. So as mentioned, I am the Director of Indigenous Studies. I am also and will be appointed to anthropology at McMaster. My research started out actually not as academia. It started out as food sovereignty for my community, and it entailed me being connected to community in a way that I think a lot of times I forget. Not everybody does. Part of my work is also connected actually to Sarah. So we're gonna be having a kind of fun conversation today because I don't very often get to take the food justice portion of my work and apply it to environment things, other than a lot of times people connect it automatically to climate change. So I'm pretty excited actually for today. And aside from that, honestly, it's the time of year where we're in the midst of the prepping of garden season. And part of my work in one of my research realms is the in-community scholar work, looking at food sovereignty at 6 nations still actually currently. So that's really just code for me getting to work on gardens with my mom. So.
Amazing. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sarah. I am currently residing on Algonquin territory, but I grew up in Niagara. A little bit about me, sort of. Yeah, I grew up in Niagara. I'm of settler ancestry, and a lot of that has also shaped some of the work that I'm learning to do now. So topically, my work focuses around land and food politics, food justice issues. But within the sort of the shape that work has taken has been around trying to understand how initially I got super into just capitalism, broadly speaking, like what is going on, but also then started to center more sort of firmly in issues of structures of settler colonialism, and that really has shaped a lot of my work more recently, just trying to understand how it works, how it's has and continues to uphold certain kinds of thinking and certain mentalities and relationships to land, food, ecologies, spaces, and how that has benefited certain groups of people, namely white people. And how I'm really interested in how bureaucracies, forms of governance, things like that, how they actually work, and how they've caused harm, and how they've sort of shaped the food system that we're all sort of living in, seeped in. I'm really interested. I sort of always go back to the comment by Raj Patel about how 100 years ago there were never grocery, or 150 years ago, think back, there were no grocery stores, and that's always something I always like to think about food as a topic and land within that bigger picture context, to try to trouble the very state and the conditions that we live within, that we work within, that we research within. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about the way that I'm thinking. But in terms of my research history and stuff like that, I've done a lot of work actually interviewing farmers themselves, trying to get a better understanding of farmers' experiences and sort of, again, how they come to understand their relationship to land. And specifically, my doctoral work was with settler farmers to try to understand their relationship and how they justify their ownership of land.
Thank you. So to follow, I basically, my training, it was in ecology, and I naively kind of thought that it was as simple as, going out and counting different types of bees on flowers on nice sunny days. Collecting that information would then sort of lead to conservation of our native biodiversity. And after more than a decade, I've come to realize that actually there's a lot more going on. There's power relations, there's all sorts of dynamics, and I've been really thankful to Dana and Lisa, who I've been working with for a couple of years. They're both here, to start thinking about relations between people and plants and bees, and trying to sort of untangle some of the struggles that I feel like I've been dealing with. Because pollinator conservation became such a hot topic in the time that I've been studying it, you can really see how money, how capitalism, how Western science, how settler colonial context has really sort of framed how things have gone. Even our literature base, for example, almost all of the studies on pollinator declines, on stressors, come from the US and the UK, and they're being applied to all sorts of countries in terms of what we know. The context for our future research questions are based on that very small subset. If you think about where those, the land masses of those two places compared to the rest of the world, and those contexts. So I've really just been struck at how much I need to learn about all of this historical, socio-political context to really understand how my research is, contributing to some of this, and also how I can change things so that we can actually learn a little bit more about our biodiversity and rebuild some of those connections to understanding our native bees and what they need, and I guess acting in a way that is in good relations, good relationship with all of these other beings that we share this space with. So Adrianne and Sarah and I had sort of an initial conversation, and I guess we were, remind me if I'm remembering this incorrectly because I didn't sleep very well last night, but we were going to start talking about the honeybee, and Adrianne had some story about keeping bees. Did you want to start off with that?
I'm going to start with something. Yes, I'll start with that, but I will also, I will say this, and I know that the rest of the speaker series may not work the same way. I have a tendency to let people ask questions during a talk. And I asked Sarah and Sheila ahead of time if that was okay to do the same thing in this instance. Partly because sometimes something comes up and you're just like, I need to put this out there now. So even if it goes into the chat, or if you put your hand up or something, that's completely okay. I'm not so concerned about that. I don't think that my co-presenters are either in this instance. Might not always be the way for people presenting work, but we are interested in having a dialogue. We're not here to present something. Like if we had the answer to fixing the pollinator problem, then Sheila would be out of work and we wouldn't be here anyway, and it would just not be as fun. So I think if we're having a conversation, I think that's really okay. When I first was asked about this, and this is why I actually mentioned that we had like bee stories, I was raised by a master gardener who I didn't know was a master gardener, who never got the full certificate and doesn't care. Someone who grows everything. I was also raised around people who grew their own food, traded for what they didn't grow themselves, and I mean like everything. That's not an exaggeration. We didn't shop at a store when I was a kid until we moved to Canada. There was a real history for me of those things, and I don't ever remember seeing like people keeping bees when I was a kid. We grew our own food, but there were enough, bugs, pests, bees, other things, that pollination was never a concern, because the environment that we lived in was as balanced as it could be, enough to the point where it wasn't a concern. And now the realities of having pollinators and making sure, it actually came to light in a really big way for me when I started working. I ran a food security program called Our Sustenance, and when it first started, it was a market in a garden, and I was like the only vendor selling produce that I'd picked from another farm because there wasn't one in our community. And we were given the opportunity to test pilot project greenhouse. And for those of you who have seen that greenhouse or know about the program itself, it was not some small thing. It was 12,000 square feet, so 84 by 144 feet, which is super cool to be able to grow food. And you think about building a food system in an Indigenous community, it has all the bells and whistles of wanting to be the right thing to be able to talk about, and to be able to provide food for people. What people didn't realize is that we were testing it to see if it was going to be a place that could grow food. Now, I mean, a greenhouse in any season with a heater and access to water, it should have been a gimme. The problem is what people didn't understand or realize at the time is that this particular greenhouse had been used as a storage facility for about 6 or 7 years. So tractors lived in there, like one tomato plant that a guy came in and looked after himself. And everything else was just an empty room. So when they started planting all these seedlings in there, they were excited because stuff grew, and they're like, yes, this is going to work. And then they couldn't figure out why we would get like squash plants, but no squash, and why we would get beans and like flowers and no beans. And that was the year that I casually said to my mom, you know what, you could come here and just work with me for like a year. It'd be super fun. Like just 1 year. That's all I'm saying. You could probably make this work. She's like, well, if it's just 1 year, I could probably do that. It turned into 7. Let's be serious. It wasn't just 1 year. But what no one in that formative process was thinking about was the fact that that space had been devoid of pollinators, of bugs, essentially. In the end, what we chose to do was actually keep bees, because And that was a long process to actually get to that point. So when we first started, that was my first exposure to thinking about what it took to actually create that environment and that situation where a food system is a whole food system, not just like, oh, we want to plant these and that's going to work. Well, what is it going to take to make that really work? And a lot of people don't think about that. How many people do you know freak out because they're like, oh, I don't want my yard to be ugly. I don't want to have dandelions. I don't want to have bugs in my yard. I don't like worms. And I remember a very dear friend of mine who's passed away now, when I first started working at the market, she used to come and tell me stories and ask me questions. She used to grill me, basically. Well, what is that? And how does that grow? And what would you cook that with? And what would you do with it? And a lot of times I was just like, oh, I wouldn't eat that. I don't care for that. That's not, turns out I'm allergic to like brassicas. So there was a reason for it, but she just would like tisk me all the time. And her favorite story to tell as she got older, when people would ask her, like, what's the most important part of the garden? What are the things that I really need to know? And she was like notorious for, you think there's going to be this beautiful, very touching, important thing like planting by the moon, or, that's what you expected to come from this old grandma lady. And she'd be like, the most important part of the garden is bugs. I would like to see your worms. I want to see your bees. I want to see your 8-legged, your 6-legged. I want to see all your grubby little things everyone's afraid of. I can't let go of that now. We ended up keeping bees because honeybees were twofold for us in terms of having an indigenous option for, yes, for the honey itself, for sweeteners, but actually for medicines as well, and making things with it, but also because we had a 12,000 square foot greenhouse with no bugs. It took almost 2 years for us to actually gain the good environment that was necessary. And when I realized that, and I let's be serious, I didn't realize that. My mom was like very busily planting things. We had this beautiful rose garden in the middle of the greenhouse. And of course, my bosses were like, why do you have like flowers that no one can eat? Well, we also have aphids, and we also have, those little potato bugs that roll up and look basketballs. And we taught kids how to garden and do things. And we were luring bugs into the building, but we were luring pollinators into the environment. We were creating a good, stable place for everything to grow. And it took a really long time for that to happen. And when I think about that, I honestly, now I'm going to have to lurk Sheila's research for the rest of my life, because I really think about the fact that things like having a grocery store 100 years ago was not heard of. But I also think about the fact that if these systems are so impacted by capitalism, colonialism, if they're so far out of sync, how long is it going to take us to start to shift things to where they need to be? And that was sort of how that happened. I have other bee stories. Honestly, I have lots of bee stories, but I don't want to just tell stories the whole time. There's lots of stuff we can talk about today. But that was the first step for me. And I think my question really is, like, what are the relationships that are occurring, and what are those pollinators, what do they need, and where are they at sort of right now, I think was the question, because I knew in our community that there was a lack based on that one space, but other people have said the same thing. Now that they're planting their garden, different bugs are in their yard. So on the larger scale, I guess I'll ask, where do we stand at the moment?
I don't know if I can answer that. And I got that thing where it says my internet is unstable, so I hope you all can hear me, but let me know if you can't. Yeah, so in terms of where we stand, we just have so many knowledge gaps. And that's maybe one of the most frustrating things. I study bumblebees, which are probably the best known, but that's just like 50 species of like 2,000 in North America. So it's a very small portion of our knowledge. And even for the bumblebees, which are the best known, we don't really know too much about how they interact. We know which plants they might visit, which groups of plants they kind of prefer, We don't know anything about really how they overwinter, how they survive the winter, how they know when to wake up, what they need in terms of nesting habitats, how they are different from each other, the different species. Yeah, there's so many unknowns. And then when you talk about the other native bees, which, you know, there's over 800 species of them in Canada, there's so little known. And we have Sandra here who works on them, and Lawrence who works on them as well. So really it's those knowledge gaps. And because there are so many knowledge gaps, it's almost like the default is like to go towards the honeybee, because it's something that we can manage, it's something we can touch, it's something we can see. The fact that they make honey is like such a bonus, because none of our native bees do that. And it's so frustrating that none of our native bees make honey, because that would be such an easier sell than, you know, trying to convince someone to spend a couple of years to build up their native bee community so that they can have, you know, cranberries and that are pollinated in this week. And then, you know, a few weeks later, it's like that delayed gratification, whereas honeybees is a much easier thing that you can see and touch and taste pretty much immediately. So it's been really frustrating for a lot of us, because we just don't have the exact information to tell people, and it's so nuanced, and we're talking about hundreds of different species and relationships that have co-evolved over so long. And then in addition to the plant pollinator relationships, there's all these other relationships with predators and parasitoids and like microbe interactions now that we're starting to understand a little bit more as well. So it's just really complex, and I just trying to find that space to just allow people to like acknowledge that things are complex and we can't control everything. And sometimes we have to just like let nature do its thing, instead of trying to like build that bee house or bring that honey beehive in to solve the problem, or, you know, plant that plant or whatever. There are a lot of different ways to feel like you're helping or changing environment for the better. But because we don't know everything, our intentions maybe are not quite aligned with what actually needs to happen. So yeah, I didn't really answer your question, but other than we don't know. But I'm curious to hear Sarah's thoughts on all of this as well, just as like the agricultural commodity perspective of it all.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've been thinking about as you two are talking is about a lot of my work is around understanding the history and politics of agri-food industrialization. And one of the key like underpinning sort of foundations is I not only want to understand the sort of mechanisms, but also the mentalities and how it shapes our way of relating to the land, to one another, to the food itself. And I think one of the basic foundations when you look at state building, the rise of global capitalism, export-oriented production, right, trade, it's all built on frameworks of comparative advantage, specialization economics, economies of scale. Like these are all inherent to the systems that we've built and the ways that we think about and relate to land in the world. It's really about that industrial model. And it's so inherent to the system. And what's so inherent in this system is the drive to standardize. And it moves our relationships in nearly every way. At every step of the interaction, it moves our relationship away from diversity towards attempts, approaches to standardize. And because you can't commodify, you can't marketize, it's much more effective and efficient to commodify something when the process is standardized. That's capitalism. Marx has said that pretty clearly, right? And so it's again inherent to any enterprise within this context. In order to produce a profit, you inherently need to exploit the land and labor. It's inherent to profit making. It's virtually impossible to extract a certain amount of profit without exploiting that thing. And so when I think about when I think about that, I think about how much we've naturalized that relationship in ourselves. And the way that we've naturalized land as a resource, as something to be managed, controlled, but not only that, but also categorized. So things become objectified in a way that allows us to commodify it. And so the problem there becomes, we become very reliant on standardized crops. The wheat basically built the nation state. And in order to trade wheat and marketize wheat, we had to standardize its varieties, make it more stable for trade, and we had to erode certain forms of its ecological diversity. Same thing with corn, soy, apples, potatoes, everything, right? And so within that, we see the need and the inherent drive to standardize means reducing diversity. And so what I see now is that, like, the problem isn't the thing, right? And I think about this with bees. Like, we're so driven to say, like, the problem is this or that bee now. And I think it's not about the thing itself. The problem is the relations. The problem is how we relate to that. So we were talking in our previous call about how we're so deeply trained to marketize things. So our solutions come to simply seek new natures and ecologies to marketize. So now it becomes about, blueberries or avocados or kale or quinoa. But the problem is our relationship of needing to marketize and industrialize that thing in a way that makes it unsustainable ecologically, because we don't know how to sit within and honor diversity. And so I think I see the same thing with bees and honey production. And that's why I think Sheila's work is so interesting, because I think what you're trying to point to, Sheila, is that, like, and I might be wrong here, but you're not necessarily saying that one bee is, like, inherently, like, evil or wrong but it's how we are building our relationships to bees in these very sort of industrialized and I think in some ways, like, very graspy ways that we start to cling on to very particular, like, efficiencies in the production of bees and our commodification of it, that actually makes it really problematic, where we establish certain kinds of, like, invasive species and all of that sort of thing that happens. But it's a product of how we're relating and the way that and so I see that sort of in all scales in our food system with how we relate to the land, and even just, like, calling things crops, right? Or, like, products. The way that I look a lot at, like, policy, subsidies, things like that, like crop insurance. It's all very categorized and commodified, and it's so deeply inherent to the entire system that we've built. I'm not sure how we move away from that.
I think you brought up a really good point, Sarah. Sheila said it right at the beginning. It's hard to sell people on the idea of, saving bumblebees or native bees who don't produce something. When you're doing research on that part of it, like, we're not here to talk about, well, honeybees are the coolest thing or the best thing because they're the only pollinator, but they might be the only pollinator that tons of people know about. How do you shift that conversation for people so they understand that honeybees are a product of a product and a product of a system, right? Because honestly, the only thing that I know bumblebees, about bumblebees, is I love their bums. Like, pictures of bumblebee bums, they just make people feel good. That's just a fact of life. If you could market that, people would be like, you know what, we need to save them. What do I have to plant to be able to see bumblebee bums in my yard? that's the advertising campaign of commodifying bumblebees. And then we're objectifying them, and it just becomes a very, like, it's a disastrous situation. And it's a, it's this waterfall of more commodity. But we're having that conversation because one of the things that happens is exactly that. How do we sell people on this idea? And that's literally what we need. We need buy-in for people to care, for them to see this as important, that native bee species that don't do anything for us, do something for us. If we were in alignment with the environment and our nature of relationships to land and each other, we would know that, and we would feel that in a way that it was important for us to preserve that relationship. So what it did for us actually didn't matter. It was more along the lines of, am I doing for this bee what I need to for it to do for something else, so that this cycle continues? Because in our conversation prior to this, Sheila said something, and I was like, yep, that absolutely encapsulates exactly what Sarah and I are talking about in our research together, which is, you won't get a blueberry if we don't have this bee species that does this, but no one cares about the bee. They just care about the blueberry. They want to see the outcome. We are the fast food generation, and it's not just a generation anymore. We are a fast food society. We are a commodity driven community. And by community, I mean this world right now. We don't, and I'm generalizing in a broad way, because the number of people who actually have that genuine connected relationship still exist in this environment. And that's one of the things for me that I think this conversation, the work that Sarah and I do together, the lurking that I'm going to do in Sheila's work from here on in, is going to be about the fact that what we actually need to be having in today's conversation is exactly that. What is our relationship to bees, land, and food justice? What is our relationship to ourselves in that setting? In academia, we talk about positionality all the time. And as an Indigenous person, I have a certain role and a mentality that is inherent, that for most of my life, I was completely oblivious to. Until I started teaching, and I was like, oh, I don't do this like other people. My students are looking at me like I am like some sort of wild animal, that they're like, when you have a cornered wild animal and it's a little bit questionable, and you can't guarantee what it's going to do. That was me. As it turns out, it wasn't them. I was the one who was cornered, and they thought I was lashing out. What I was really doing was talking and teaching in a way that made sense to me, and it was unpredictable and strange. The intersections of all of these things comes back again to that relational connection to ourselves and to land. Every single thing, every relationship that we could talk about. How many on the call right now, how many people know what plant you need to plant to have monarch butterflies come to your yard? We know. I know we know.
I guess everyone probably.
Yeah, see, Nadia's like, yep, I'm in. I know, we know. Sarah, this is the thing. We know exactly what to do to find the right thing. Some people want honeybees. I'll be honest with you guys. I am trying to get a hive of honeybees right now to exit my house and enter the hive that's beside my house. Unsuccessfully so far. I don't know what to say. I've invited them out. I've definitely done all the things that I have tried, but at the end of all of this as well, what it comes down to is, what is their relationship to what's happening, and where do they need to be? And right now they think they need to be in my house. But I also have on the other side of my house carpenter bees who have decided they need to be in my house. I have bumblebees who need to be in my yard. I have, I have a lot of property on at my house. So in fairness, I have a larger environmental system. The natural world is sort of invading. Carolyn's asked a question, and that's a great question. The idea of grassroots or bottom-up engagement. I'm gonna let you guys answer that because I don't, there's no bottom in my engagement. So
yeah, I just wanted to sort of add to what you were saying, Adrianne, about the thinking about, like, I think so often, and I've heard this in your work, Sheila, too, of like that in order to preserve, even the word preserve, right? Like in order to act in ways that are life-giving for something, you know, let's call it preserve or conserve or whatever, the way that our mentality seems to be that we need to sell what it does for us, right? Even like I mentioned this before about mosquitoes, right? Like I hear over and over and over again this stuff about like, here's all the good that mosquitoes do, so like don't hate them. But I think what it points to for me is a sort of a way we've gone astray a little bit with our relationality with the land, in that we can only understand things in relationship to what they give us, not our obligation to that, or what is our obligation or responsibility. In what ways can we be accepting and understanding of that thing in and of itself, not just in relationship to us or how it can benefit us. I think that's like, for me, that's a much more difficult and like denaturalized way of thinking about my relationship to other than human beings. It's a sort of like, I see it as a practice. So when I think about the grassroots bottom-up engagement, I think I think it's more about focusing on whatever you're doing. It's focusing on your being really intentional and thoughtful about your relationality to that topic or to that issue. Because yes, I think grassroots, in some ways, if you're defining it as a more direct relationship, I think there's benefit to that, because I think one of the issues that I see is the way that we large scale industries or structures or institutions, what they do is they serve to separate. They serve to move people away out of relationship, out of direct relationship to one another and to you know, the land or spaces, in ways that make it really easy for us to accept exploitation and things like that. So in some ways, if that's what you mean by grassroots, is a more sort of a direct connection to things that sort of forces us into a means of engagement in a different way, then that's really great. But I don't think that's necessarily always the case. I think we can still always engage in harmful ways, myself included. But it's about like being reflective around how that might happen, and then trying to sort of think through how we might behave differently or think differently around that.
Yeah. Let's take Nadia's question and then Jess.
Hi, so I wanted to ask about, so we're talking about how we kind of have this talk about bees and pollination, and it's all about the usefulness of the species to us. But then I remembered, you know, the early kind of 90s preservation efforts around tigers and pandas. It was never the talk about like, oh, why are tigers useful, right? We never talked about. In fact, many of the kind of in certain areas, the conservation issue is the fact that tigers are dangerous. So when populated areas start encroaching on their habitats, people start killing them because they start, you know, being like a hazard. And this is also something I've noticed when I do my public speaking. When I ask people, you know, can you name a bee? Most people say honeybee. Sometimes people say bumblebees, but usually I have to prompt them and then it clicks that yes, bumblebees are bees too. And then I actually usually shift the conversation away from usefulness because, you know, honeybees give us honey, but bumblebees and other bees, you know, pollinate. And also once you show them the bees, like physically show them samples of, you know, bumblebees and the beautiful, like metallic bees everybody loves because they're just stunning, the conversation shifts away from usefulness very quickly. So perhaps because we you know, in conservation efforts, we do have to engage the public. They have to care for anything to work, and we need to kind of you know, sell them on this bee or on this conservation project why it's going to be useful. So perhaps if we want to step away from the usefulness because it's not always evident why this particular bumblebee species is useful now, or why this kind of random solitary bee is very useful to us. Perhaps we can lean more into the strategies, you know, the tiger people used in the 90s of being just stunning and having kind of these gorgeous pictures that engage the imagination of the people.
Yeah, or just having the right to exist because they exist and not having to sell
that's
it anyway.
true. That is true. But I absolutely agree with you. But the problem, the issue there is then you start, well, why this bee and not that bee? Or like you can have start kind of like, you know, everything has a right to exist. But at the end of the day, I can't care about everything. Right? Like I have limited mental resources.
But I wonder if my thought too would be, I wonder if we built collective structures and systems that work towards life giving rather than sort of a sense of like, let's it's like some things must die at the expense of other. I think there's a sort of mentality of a way of building a system of governance or decision making that can sort of be life affirming rather than that kind of model of like it reminds me of
it's almost triage.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. It reminds me of like the kind of way that we deal with pollution, right? Where or toxins, where it's like, oh, up to this amount, and then we we can't pollute any more than that because like there's that threshold. That's it, that threshold. And I think that's a sort of same kind of mentality of like, oh, well, let's pollute up to this amount, and because it produces a way of thinking and governing and decision making that I don't think is exactly like life affirming.
Sure, I understand that. I'm sorry if this becomes a dialogue. I can go away if you guys want, but I understand what you're saying. I think the issue here is so I understand the idea of such a structure, but the way it would function is kind of very vague to me. So unless there is something where you can like kind of illuminate me about how this system would work, I don't understand how it would work. And the other issue is that there are species in need here and now, right? Perhaps we can build a governance system like that, but maybe it's going to take 20, 30, 100 years. And we're going to lose a lot of species in the meantime. So when we want to, you know, get a grant from the government to build a greenhouse, to build a meadow, to restore land, we got to sell them on that idea.
So working within the system as it is now.
Yes, and so we can do both, I think. I think we can work for as the system, you know, as Sheila mentioned, we have so much limited data, so many holes in our knowledge that it's like staggering. So perhaps the best money spent now is not restorative, but maybe it is filling out those knowledge gaps. And we can promote new ways, because I guess another point I'm trying to, sorry, I'm wavering, but yes, we can think about life affirming, but for example, okay, if we want to convert a space that's an invasive plant into a native meadow, well, guess what? We're choosing to kill the invasive plant. It has a right to exist as much as the native meadow. So I think a kind of a triage or a threshold or a cost benefit analysis will always come into a thinking, because if we choose to do something, we're choosing to do one thing and not another.
I think there's a part of this conversation that is important to consider, and it's actually going back to Carolyn's question and before we move to Jess's. One of the things that we have to remember is that you're right in the sense that if you choose to eliminate an invasive species, even though it has the right to live, you are negating the history of it invading. Like, you can't forget how it got to where it is. And that applies to all things: people, plants, animals, history. Even going back to the example of the tiger, saving the tigers because they're, endangered now, because humans got close to their environment, because we are actually invading their territory, because the system of land use and agriculture and taking and commodifying has impacted their environment. So now we are at risk because of our actions. This is not just their right to live. Like, there's a whole other system of things. So when we're talking about that, even the bid to try and tell people, we need to do this to save the tigers or to save the pandas or the whatever they are, all of that still comes down to it. Yes, part of it is that sales of that notion of protecting, but we have to remember that they're in danger because we have done something. We aren't just out here looking at something like, oh my God, all of these, suddenly there's no panda habitat because they ate it. No, see, they actually knew. There's no way that they could have ever done that. They didn't endanger themselves. So saving them is still the same system of commodity. It is still that system of trade. Whether they created that system or not, they are still part of it. And Sarah mentioned changing the system and altering the system, and that goes to Carolyn's question. Having bottom-up or grassroots engagements, part of the reason why that is what we promote and it's how we operate is because none of us are interested, and I'm just speaking out of turn, of course, but you can agree or disagree. None of us are interested in actually trying to run the government. We don't want to expose ourselves or become part of the system we are actually not promoting. So we do advocate for grassroots and bottom-up engagement, because what we're doing actually is promoting and building engagement on an individual level, because at some stage, and that's that shift of this lifetime, the next lifetime, our children's lifetime, we have to figure out where we sit. That's the positionality that I talked about at the very beginning. One of my biggest, probably worst jokes that I tell on earth is to tell people that I want to solve world hunger and not tell anybody. I don't want to tell anyone, because I know that if I know how to take care of my environment, my property has 15 acres of Carolinian forest, and I have to care for that. That's my duty. I did purchase it. It is part of a system, but I also know that I don't allow for people to come and take from it. I don't allow for, I don't add to or remove other things in that system. But understanding that my food system doesn't stop here. I also make sure that my relatives have enough. I make sure that my family, that my neighbors are cared for. Part of that single movement in my house is that ripple. I still have to live in this system that we're in. I just want to find the ways that I can do that as ethically to my own standard as possible. Because at the end of the day, I still drive a car and I still love it. But I don't want to exist 500 years ago. I don't want to have to hustle every day to eat, blueberries and wild things and only. I want those things in my life, but I also want to be able to go buy a cauliflower pizza because I love them. Like, that's the conversation where we have to remember that there are multiple systems interacting at all times. Jess, I don't want to get caught on just like we could rabbit hole this whole day. Jess, did you have a question?
Well, sorry. So I have so many thoughts, and this is probably going to come off as super inarticulate, but bear with me. So I'm a government scientist. And so this conversation, I think, is really thought-provoking, especially from the way that we do science in a government. I mean, heck, we have people whose their job title is commercialization officer. Like, that is their job, is to commodify and to streamline and to standardize everything. And I'm already a little bit of an oddball because I am a wild bee ecologist in a land of people who study how to make crops make more money. So I'm constantly justifying what I do to my fellow scientists. But I wonder, like, as someone, how do I go about, like, I don't know, how do I go about from, like, is there anything I can do from the inside? To sort of to influence how the system works? Because I mean, when we talk with, I mean, most of the farmers that I deal with are all settler farmers. So there's that relationship as well, but there's so much, it's all about commercialization, and we're so locked into the system. I'm just trying to think of ways, little things, little ways to change things.
I have some thoughts on that, unless Sheila, do you want to say something?
No, go for it, Sarah. So just to clarify, Jess is with Ag Canada.
Yeah,
So,
I think going, also extending off of what Adrianne was saying around, like, for my part, I'm interested in collective change to a degree, but I'm not interested in propping up the system in its current form and function and conditions. So for instance, I really don't want to support our current system of agricultural governance, subsidies. I think it's incredibly problematic. I think the fact that, you know, if we look at the numbers, the amount of funding that goes towards export-oriented agriculture, that goes towards propping up current systems that are not life-affirming, that are incredibly industrial, in the sense that when I speak to bureaucrats themselves, like at the ministry, at Ag Canada, or at OMAFRA, they agree that in a lot of ways that scale of production is problematic, but we still, in terms of our finances and our subsidies, are propping that up, you know, to the 90% of our funding goes towards the, if not more, depending on how you sort of examine it, you know, even in terms of organic production, it usually has to sort of scale to a degree, right? So I think for me, I want to maintain a kind of imagination where, when I think of the reason why I find that that grocery store example so useful, is because I hope that in another 100 years, that we don't have this current configuration of wealth concentration, corporate concentration. Like, I want to look towards a world where, yes, we're able to sort of use the tools that make our lives easier, but technology innovation should be built and maintained in the interest of human well-being, not in the interest of, you know, surveilling migrant workers, and in the interest of automating in order so that farmers can further concentrate their production, or so that Loblaws can make a higher profit next year when it's already made, you know, like $56 billion in the first quarter. Like, I think that's the problem that I'm pointing to, is that we can use the tools that we're building and that we have for human well-being, and not for profit accumulation. That's what I want to see.
I'm gonna take this to perhaps a different mode, just for fun and just for a minute. Jess asked a really practical question: what can I do from the inside, as someone who is part of the system, that while you are not necessarily the norm in that system, you're still in the system and you see it. I want to give you, and I tend to be I'm going to say simplistic in my approach. Let me just tell you some things that I feel like you could do, and maybe you have this knowledge and I don't know, and that will be something where you'll be like, oh yeah, I already got that. Understand your perception of agriculture, of farming. Understand your perception of and your belief in environment. Indigenous, and I'll be specific, Haudenosaunee people are agricultural people, but no one ever calls us farmers. We produced enough. If you look at the history books, and here's where I'm telling you, this is something you can actually do to understand and look at the relationship that we have currently versus what existed in the past. If you look at history books, there is actually documented proof that when settlers first came here, they, in their bid to control the Haudenosaunee nations, burned our storehouses of food. Partly because they thought it would help eradicate us and move us on. Separate from that, let's look at the agriculture aspect of that for just a minute. When you look at the history books, they say that they burned millions of bushels of corn. Nobody ever says, well, the Haudenosaunee, they're like super farmers. They had millions of bushels of corn to burn. But nobody ever talks about that because we were considered less than and not human. If you look back at the history of that, and then you in turn come to understand for yourself traditional ecological knowledge from an Indigenous perspective, and you understand what our version of large-scale agriculture is, because it doesn't mean we didn't mass produce things. We did. Millions of bushels, I'm going to keep saying it, millions of bushels of corn, enough to provide for our community and the next 2 neighboring communities, in case there was times of struggle, in case animals didn't come, in case hunting was poor, in case fishing was bad. Corn, beans, and squash can actually sustain you. Those 3 foods, it's our traditional foods. Those 3 foods can actually sustain you if you have nothing else. It'd be the plainest dinner for the next 6 months ever. However, have you ever heard, read, seen a policy about using, synergistically grown crops from an Indigenous perspective? Is that something the government does? Probably not. Like, our history is not, the goal of government is literally to erase our history. What you can do is understand the history of growing in this continent. What you can personally understand is, if I approach growing and understanding agriculture in all of its forms, because agriculture is not, farming isn't just one way. It doesn't always have to be that way. Indigenous communities farmed, but we also knew how to care for the environment so that it wasn't depleted. And that's true of fish, of wildlife, of plants, of agriculture. We were agricultural people here. So it's not like, even in this, growing food isn't the bad guy. It's one person growing all the food and selling it to another country and then making us buy it back. That's the messed up one. That's the part where it gets hazy for me. So, and I'll say this to everybody, every single person on the call, what you can do, whether you work at Ag Canada or you are interested, 2 things. I'm just going to give you 2 things. 1, make bumblebee bum art like the next big thing. Buy the art, take pictures of the bums. I don't know, it sounds terrible and inappropriate, and here we are because I love them. The other thing is grow food. Just grow a little bit of food for yourself, for your neighbor. I don't care if you don't even grow stuff you don't like, but you're good at. Give it away. Grow food.
I'm really good at dandelions. They
Same.
are delicious.
I'm not a fan. I won't lie. They're bitter. I just am like, ooh. But having said that, without fail, I love Halloween. I always have a pumpkin because I had a pumpkin on my porch and I threw it in the yard in the fall. And every year I get a pumpkin plant, and it's just one of those things. And it's like, it's the cycle of life. There are 1,000,001 things that you can do sometimes. And here's the part where this is a difficult conversation for people, because we are driven by results, right? That's the nature of our current society. one of the best things that I can suggest to you is play the long game. Play the long game. Grow food. Do things. Share food. And educate ourselves. This conversation alone, opening up the door to this conversation, is part of that process. That literally is, feel like I did huge things today just by showing up here, by listening, by asking questions, by being involved in the conversations. Because the long game is the system that we're in right now. If the pandemic has shown us anything, nothing is as sustainable as we like to hope that it is. And some of us hope that it's not sustainable at all. The system of economy right now that we're in, people hope it doesn't work. But learn more about it. And in light of the world the way that it is, I also urge people to learn Indigenous history, because not just the horrific things that are going on, learn the amazing things that are going on out in the world. Don Morrison and salmon preservation out west, the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, the lobster fisheries. There are huge shifts going on in the world right now that people are talking about in a negative way, because a Mi'kmaq fishery that is owned by the people who knew how to preserve food. And I say preserve not like canning, but like how to preserve the environment so that sustainable food could happen. It's occurring right now.
I'm actually in New Brunswick, so.
But we don't want, the larger system doesn't want to talk about those things, because it does upset the balance of power that we're accustomed to. Amro asked a good question. Is there a model of success in landscape and species conservation that can be applied in the context of bee conservation here? We're all looking at you now, Sheila.
Yeah, no, I don't know if I know that answer. But I just wanted to say something probably, again, inarticulate about the grassroots question, because I think the bee example is hilarious in this. Having been involved in like other sort of activist spaces, like anti-racism spaces and climate spaces, it's really interesting to think about how the grassrootsness of pollinator conservation are the like wealthy homeowners. They're the ones that are like fighting for the things, or the beekeeping organizations, which tend to be like white and mostly male, and probably wealthy to some extent. So it's just like, there is none of that, like, maybe there is in sort of like the small scale urban food movement, maybe there's a little bit more diversity in those, but not in terms of like the Save the Bee movement. It's so much about wealth and whiteness. So I really struggle with this idea of like including the public and the grassroots movements, because it is this like really small subset of people with a lot of privilege. And I've been trying to think about how it can be more grassroots, how you can have youth engaged, which aren't just youth who live in homes and can plant pollinator plants in their like parents' houses or whatever. So yeah, that's sorry. I was going back to something that I was just that we had talked about before. But thinking about Amro's question, I don't know. I think it kind of goes back to what Sarah was talking about in terms of imagination. I don't know if we have any models of success, and if there are models of success in other places. Maybe other people in this call have some examples that they want to share. But I feel like everything is so like context specific, and there's histories and relationships that are so specific to where we are right now, that I'm not sure that we can like just easily think about other examples and try to implement them here. I feel like there's so much unlearning and undoing and understanding of the systems of power that needs to be done like here to really do a good job with this. And I feel like Dana and Lisa and I are trying to touch on that a little bit more. And the stuff that Lisa and Dan are doing, like it's so grassroots. It's like, talking to artists about building pollinators, it's, art installations. And I don't know, I just feel like we need to like start at that like really low level. And I don't know if we can just move to like a landscape level model of success. I don't know, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, Emma. If you have any more thoughts about where you came up with that question.
I was going to ask a question as well, Sheila. There's a couple of different things. One, and I'll ask this specifically, is there, and I'm not talking like landscape and having a full system, though maybe Amaral has an answer to that. But if we're talking about bee conservation here, you've mentioned like many different varieties of bees. So are there, and this is gonna sound super simplistic, is there a plant that bees don't like? Like is there something where it's just like, this is not useful to bees?
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess some of the wind pollinated ones, like grasses and stuff, might be not that useful, but then they might be used for like shelter. So I think just like having a diversity of native plants, especially things that bloom early in the spring all the way to the late fall, you're inviting all sorts of different things into your property or space that maybe you don't have to actually name what you're inviting. You just allow things to appear. Yeah. But,
okay, who wants to plant skunk cabbage though, really, at Lawrence? I'm just asking the question. If it smells like something that's died, or flies are visiting it because it smells like something.
But Sheila, didn't you sort of answer? I think you answered it when you said about place specific knowledge. Like, to me, it's like that's sort of the answer, is like getting to know a specific place, paying attention, like building place, a kind of localization of our understanding and our relationship to a space. Isn't that sort of our best bet in terms of being able to build a kind of ecological system that is attentive to diversity?
Yeah. Yeah, and there was a recent paper by Richard Schuster where Indigenous managed protected areas had a lot higher species diversity than federally managed protected areas. That was in Australia, Canada, and Brazil. And I've been really thinking about that in terms of pollinators as well. Like, that study was just vertebrates, which is a lot fewer species, but thinking about the different types of management and you know, what kinds of management might promote more diversity. One thing that a friend of mine said when I was going on my no mow May rants, because I think it's like so ridiculous that so many environmental NGOs told people that if they want to save bees, they just have to not mow their lawn for a little bit and let some dandelions grow. And that's like the extent of, you know, our expectations right now of people, because yeah, that's so ridiculous in so many different ways. But she mentioned, my friend just mentioned this world of carescaping. So not just letting things go wild and assuming that it'll be a good thing, but actually learning about what you have there, being able to identify, in some cases, removing things that might be invasive and stopping other plants or insects from coming in. I don't know what Lisa's talking about here with ticks. Oh yeah, totally. Oh, that was a private message, sorry. But yeah, growing grass promotes ticks. Totally not cool either. Sorry, Lisa, I didn't realize that was a private message, but I just said it. But yeah, there's so many reasons why that was a bad idea. And a lot of, you know, if some bees do live in tall grass. So if they had decided that, oh, this, you know, not mown area is a great place for me to start my nest, and then June 1st hits and all of a sudden all of these people have permission to go and mow their lawns. There's so many things with that also really bother me.
Sheila, I've been reading more about, because I'm trying to build an understanding of my local landscape to build. I've been reading about meadowscaping, and one thing that I'm learning is a really strategic sort of relationality with things like mowing, actually, to get to certain perennial wild flowers and grasses actually need a certain kind of care and mowing at very specific points, because they grow slower than other the sort of fast growing. So
none of this fits a good hashtag.
That's right. Like when I'm reading about it, I'm like overwhelmed. Like, okay, so in February I have to do this, and then and then I have to prepare for next year. Right? It's like a whole way of relating and understanding, like, local sort of microclimate and habitat of that space to understand what you would need to do.
Amro's got the longest hashtag.
Some plants need less frequent mowing. I love it.
He doesn't use Twitter that much. He doesn't know about the limitations there. But Amber, why don't you come back and talk to us about where your question was coming from and your thoughts?
Yeah, we talked about like the magnitude of the problem, right? It's a big problem, and I just wanted to kind of hear learn more about whether it's such a drastic shift, right? Because we're not talking, we're essentially talking about like a fundamental shift in how we value our land and our commodities, and I guess I'm just having a hard time seeing how it could work. So I was just looking to see where there's been kind of success stories, because at the end of the day, when we're trying to convince people to care about bees, well, and other things too, and if just like the hashtags, right? It's easy for people to kind of remember small, simple kind of solutions. Okay, do this, and like, yeah, all right, I'll do that. But then if you tell them, okay, well, you have to do this, and that, and then we have to change the way of the government structure and so on, it just becomes like you get stuck in the weeds, you get lost in the weeds. So how can we change the system in a way that will lead to the change that we want, and get buy-in from people, and do that soon before we lose our bees? I think it's a very complex problem, and sorry, my contractor is here. I'm going to go on mute. Sorry, guys.
So luckily we don't have to answer Amro's question because he's not going to be here to listen.
But I do think that there's a lot of examples of it being done well, right? Like certain kinds of agroecological practices, permaculture practices. There's so many examples of farms, for instance, that and you might call them, they don't even look like your traditional view. Going back to what Adrianne said, I really want us to like break out of our traditional understanding of farm and farmer. But there's beautiful examples of folks living in relationship to a certain space that is much more coherent to that space and much more reciprocal to that space. But we don't actually have collective systems that nourish and support that. We would need to, redistribute our subsidy systems. We would need to, redistribute our governance systems to pay more attention to that, to recognize and honor those kinds of practices instead of trying to scale them up to industrial systems. Look at what's happened with organic. So I do think that like there's examples. It's just that we keep trying to industrialize them in a way that's super problematic.
I think there's something else to be said for Amro, though he's now leaving. There's something else to be said that we're all sort of dancing around the conversation, and it was pinpoint clear for like a half a second for me. Sheila's work is about selling the idea of preservation and conservation and bees and pollinators, as if that's the answer, and as if that's separate from Sarah and I's research on land relationship, as if it's separate from my work on Indigenous food sovereignty or food sovereignty generally, or food systems or land relationship or rematriation. The title of our talk is Bees, Land, and Food Justice. If we're actually going to talk about that, we need buy-in on Sheila's work from other people. But your work is exactly the same work that I'm doing. And my work is exactly the same work that Sarah's doing. And we are all approaching the same conversation from different places. We are all ultimately still talking about how do I connect myself and other people and get them to pay attention to what they're doing where. Bees need to exist because Adrianne wants to feed people. Adrianne wants to feed people, and so she needs Sarah to talk to farmers about how they're treating their land and how they have relationship to that place. And Sarah needs to do that work so that they understand, and those farmers that she talks to understand that Sheila wants bees to live on that land that they're farming. We are all doing the same work. And it's all the conversation that Emerald's like, well, there's no, we need to do this one thing. We do. We all do need to do this one thing. But if we all understand our relationship, that's a good question, Carolyn. If we all do this relationship, mainstream buy-in is the large scale. And frankly, unfortunately, it literally is promoting the same system that we're talking about, like sort of modifying. If we go in and we're like, we need mainstream buy-in, all we're going to do is commodify exactly what we're talking about, which is talking about not commodifying our relationship to land. So do we really need to mainstream it? Maybe. It would definitely cause a shift, and it would cause a large scale shift. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right or only approach. Because right now, grassroots and person-to-person engagement is literally what we're doing. Every single person who knows about Sheila's work knows about Sheila's work, but they may have never heard of me or Sarah. Similarly, with the exception, of course, of people who have seen us in the same spaces at the same time, would never know that Sarah and I's work crosses boundaries at all. We each have our own pool of people who interact with us, see us, find us, understand what we're doing. Really, the mainstream buy-in, maybe what we need to do is not mainstream buy-in. What we need to do is cross-promote. I understand my way of the world, and here's the relationship that I have to land. And here's the way that I work with it, because I'm not 500 years ago or 600 years ago. I am today. But I know now that Sheila's doing this work, and it could be impactful, because end of the day, my friend Ione used to tell me the best and most important part of your garden is your bugs. And I was all like, please don't let them get on me. Please don't let them get on me. But I still want them. So am I going to try and figure that out? Yes. Do I have an issue with farming? No. Do I have an issue with large scale unhealthy environmental farming? Yeah, I do. But does that mean that I wouldn't consider myself a farmer if I grew enough food for my community? I would totally grow enough food for my community if it meant that I could do it in a way that was sustainable and healthy. Do I want to do it? No, because I don't love to get my hands dirty. It might get bugs on me. But would I tell people about Sheila's work? Yes, every day. Would I talk to Sarah? Absolutely. And frankly, we do. We research together about land relationship.
I think, Adrianne, what you're saying too reminds me of, it reminds me of my deep desire for us to honor diversity. I think like in our models of being, like when I'm in my garden, how do I honor diversity? But also when I'm talking to bureaucrats, how do I suggest that they honor diversity? So one thing that I think is super problematic in governance systems is the sort of approach that of impact assessments. That I've heard this time and again. Environmental impact assessments always prefer, or for the most part, prefer large scale emitters, and therefore like to allocate funding towards large scale farmers, because if they get them to reduce their emissions and become sort of more like sustainable, then that's a bigger reduction in their footprint. So then inherently, we're always sort of seeking and prioritizing and moving towards these sort of larger scale producers, processors, and one thing I'd love to see is moving towards supporting and encouraging smaller scale producers, more locally specific producers. And that would require a shift in a pretty significant shift in how things are done within government, but also industry and government's relationship to industry would have to change really dramatically, because it's not just, I don't want to just sit and blame government, because like companies are by far, I would say we are far more implicated in some of these harms.
Just put in the chat a really short paper that I now assign to my students, because so much of the narrative around science is that we are like objective and we just look at data and we don't take science. But your comments about risk assessment, Sarah, are the ones that do the science to determine what our threshold of risk is, what the the LD50, like the number of bees that could die, what that concentration is after that, what the governments use to make these regulations and these processes. So this short paper is just a really good way to just think about, again, how our science is being used within these systems. And if there are alternatives, can we imagine alternatives for our own research and our own, our own research programs and experimental designs. So a little off topic, but I just
I think that's fantastic, because I'm so interested in how data scientists or so-called quantitative scientists can better understand the political conditions that they're working within. And Adrianne touched on this, of like understanding the injustices and the harms that surround. Because I think this idea that data or science can be neutral, unbiased, like, why did you choose this topic? Why are you even here asking these questions? I think is like, that's what we should all be asking ourselves, regardless of what, kind of how are we shaping our approach to science. And I think,
and how could we use science to like dismantle a little bit of some of these systems in our own ways without putting the burden on Indigenous people. Like, I feel like often these kinds of talks where there's like one or two Indigenous community members there, it's always like, so how do we fix this? What do we do next? But as a scientist now, I'm seeing more and more how, without having to have those conversations, I can think about collecting data at a site which is slated for development or something that might find rare bumblebees, that might kick in some policies or whatever. And some people might say that that's not objective science, but I mean, I don't know, we can have a conversation about that too. But there are ways that we can use how we design our research programs and what funding we apply for and how we use the funding. And I think the Finding Flowers project with Lisa and Dana is a good example of that, of like using, this shiny money that Justin Trudeau all of a sudden came up with right before an election or what have you, to transfer it into like now we always keep an open mind and be creative around it. And it might not fit that well with like TNP criteria or what have you, like the academic metrics of success. But these opportunities have come up, and so it's useful to think about things as part of the broader system. I see Carolyn's here to wrap us up.
And she's muted.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Adrianne. So yeah, we have to honor everyone's time. And although I feel like I could sit here for a very, very long time and listen to some of these discussions that are really opening up perspectives and connecting in new ways. I really want to thank all three of you, Adrianne, Sarah, and Sheila, for sharing your expertise and your perspectives with all of us today. And I want to thank everyone else for taking the time to gather and to share and to learn and to really consider, how our own research or practices are felt on the land and how we can connect with the land and our responsibility to the land. I also agree with Adrianne that bumblebee butts are the best. So I just wanted to say that. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I hope everyone has a great weekend and go outside and go plant some plants that you can eat. And I think that's a really great way that we can all connect with our land, whether it be in a pot or in the ground. Find a way that you can eat something that you grow yourself. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you.
you.